right, everybody, welcome back to the Debrief podcast here on FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso. I'm joined in studio by Ted Baker. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. Ted, we are back, and once again, we have like 6 or 7 topics that all feel loosely connected by the same guiding principles that we keep yelling about every week.
I'm just glad that COVID's over and we don't have to talk about that anymore.
Wow, thank God. So let's start with a recent Wall Street Journal report which looked at master's degrees awarded by colleges and universities across the country, particularly those in the top tier, and evaluated them on a debt-to-earning ratio, which I thought was pretty interesting. Turns out some of the most elite schools in the country are effectively selling degrees for $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, with recipients at the end of it only making $30,000 or $40,000 a year. They're effectively crushed by debt. This is nothing new. We've talked about this a bunch of times before on the show. But I'm curious because I think we haven't really spent too much time actually looking specifically at what the potential fixes are. We've pointed at a lot of the problems, but when we think about higher ed, and I don't think this is exclusively a master's degree problem, I think this is an undergrad level as well as an postgrad, graduate level problem in higher education. So when you think of this issue, this debt to income ratio problem that we're obviously talking about here, what are some of the potential fixes that come to your mind as far as what might work or what might be practical in terms of making a reality?
Well, I think the first one is the cost has to come down. I'm amazed, when I went through my education, and I went to a 1-year tech school for broadcasting back in the late 70s, but the idea even then of going into debt, the equivalent of a home mortgage, before you ever start would have seemed absurd. I don't see how anyone starts off their life in the working world with the equivalent of a home mortgage around their necks already, $100,000, $200,000 debt. Also, I just think that the purpose of a liberal arts education, for example, at one time, was not so much to get you a job or a better job. It was to make you a better thinker and a more well-rounded person. I'm not sure in today's economy that we can afford that anymore. So I think the other thing that colleges might want to consider is really tailoring more of the curriculum toward the jobs that are in the market and are going to be in the market in the years to come, like some of the community colleges are doing. I don't think that you can afford to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a degree that has little or no value in the marketplace anymore.
Okay, so a few of the things that I had thought about after reading this story and listening to a couple podcasts on the topic, as well as sort of piggybacking off of our countless conversations about this. Here's what I'm thinking. First, you probably have to do something about the gigantic endowments that a lot of these universities and colleges are carrying, right? They've got billions and billions of dollars quite literally sitting in the bank. And I understand that there are limits to what they can do with these funds, or so they argue. But I think you have to do something about these institutions having billions in the bank and then also charging hundreds of thousands of dollars when the trade-off for that is a job that pays $30,000 or $40,000.
Right. What's the purpose of a university if it has $2 billion in the bank?
Right.
And is charging students an exorbitant amount to go there when they could easily afford to extend free education to all their students if they wanted to.
Right. And then continuing on that line of thinking, I think there has to be something done about the incentives and tax breaks that universities and colleges get in the local community if this is going to be the reality. If the reality is going to be that even if you aren't this in name, you are a for-profit institution. Colleges and universities, I understand, operate in sort of this ether where they aren't a for-profit institution but have billions in the bank and also have quite literally millions of dollars coming in every year in terms of revenue and operating. That needs, something has to be done there. And then I think probably the biggest one is there needs to be a cap on these federal student loans based on the debt to income ratio used in that story. Why is a student who is going to obtain a degree that's going to land them a job that pays $30,000 to $40,000 a year allowed to take out $300,000 in loans or accumulate that over a period of time. That data is readily available. The schools have to produce that data. The schools have to have that data not only internally, but the public schools have to ship that data out. To me, it just seems like it would make far more sense if the federal government were going to clamp down in some way on this, that they just clamp down on who they're going to loan to if there is basically a financial hardship or financial need. If you need a loan, then obviously you don't have cash to pay for this education, whatever that education might be. And if at the end of it you're going to have $125,000 in debt and a job that only pays you $30,000 a year with a maximum upside of, say, 50 or 55, there's absolutely no way that you should be getting those loans, or those loans should be getting doled out. And it's interesting because they talked, obviously, in the particular story that we linked to today in the Post, it's really focused on film and sort of these artsy majors and study programs, right? But there's a lot of practical ones as well, journalism as an example, that has the same fundamental problem. You can go to a high-profile higher ed institution, pay tens of thousands of dollars a year, perhaps racking up $100,000, $200,000 in debt, and then go work in a newsroom owned by Gannett or owned by Sinclair or whatever the case may be, or even a local one, and you're only going to make $25,000, $30,000, $35,000, $40,000 a year until you get to a certain point, or until you check off enough boxes. But a vast majority of the people in the working industry make on the low end of that scale, not on the high end of that scale. So I think it needs to be based more on numbers, more on averages, and less on the outliers or the prospect of. I thought it was interesting. They cited some of the advertising material that schools like Columbia use for their film program, which was one of the worst master's programs that the story looked at. And they cited all these examples of, well, you're going to have all these connections in LA, you're going to have all these connections in Hollywood, and it's going to be all great. And that just isn't. It doesn't match reality at all. So.
Well, and I think some of this, we always tie things back to bigger themes. I was thinking about this earlier. It's just the growth of the debt economy in America. Go back to the early mid-1950s after World War II. Big economic boom. All the soldiers are back. In those days, I'm willing to bet pretty much the only thing you borrowed money to get was your house. Even cars in those days, cars you'd pay cash. I don't know what a car cost in 1955, probably $1,500. You'd save up, you'd pay cash. Today, we buy our refrigerator on credit. We buy our bedroom set on credit. We buy everything on credit. And so a large amount of money that would otherwise be going to productive things goes to banks in interest.
Well, and you want to talk about a larger systemic issue. Debt is access, right? Like, quite literally, debt is access to the most essential things or the most fundamental things that we consider to be part and parcel to the American dream.
Yeah.
And if you don't, or if you're unwilling to, you're not going to get it. Now, here's the ironic thing. And this is one of we were talking a little bit before about the challenges or some of the issues around this idea. Well, just go be a tradesman. Just go be a tradesman, and that's the answer to all of this. That is one of those rare circumstances. We cited plumbers before. We talked about plumbers. You can talk about carpenters. You can talk whatever you want to talk about is in those skilled trades where there's a lot of money to be made, and right now relatively low cost. You could see the value of that education being worth far more than the education that you're getting in film or in whatever these sort of niche topics are in the lifetime return on that investment.
Well, that's why I'm wondering
that's not how it's calculated. And that's the part that's kind of mind-boggling.
Maybe more four-year colleges ought to offer plumbing or carpentry certificate programs for a year or two, or maybe they have to diversify their offerings to meet the marketplace. Because I think one of the reasons enrollment is down is because I think students and their parents are seeing these things that we're talking about. They're saying, why do I want to start my working life $200,000 in debt with a degree that's going to get me a starting salary of 30 or 35?
Could we really objectively expect colleges and universities, in particular the four-year institutions, lean into something that, like you said, is clearly outside their best interest? I mean, if you aren't tying students down for 4 years, you're talking about a big overhaul of your structure. And I think about what a lot of these colleges and universities, even smaller ones, you think about, Hobart and William Smith colleges in Geneva, the amount of infrastructure that exists there that really only has to exist because it's a four-year institution. If it weren't a four-year institution, you wouldn't need a lion's share of what's there. So I guess part of me is a little bit, I don't know. I just don't see it ever being in the best interest of these institutions.
Well,
to,
it would be a
do the right
huge
thing.
mission change and also an identity change. And look at, for an example, Cornell.
Yep.
I mean, Ivy League institution, they don't want to be known as a vocational technical program. Most four-year schools don't. Probably the greater answer would be to figure out why most of the other developed nations on Earth provided free secondary education to people years ago and why we can't. I mean, you go to most places in Europe, the democratic socialist countries, and any post-high school education is free.
Yeah, and I think without any sort of systemic across-the-board effort to, like we've talked about before, hone people into these fields, rein them into these fields, I think what you wind up seeing is like what we've seen in our region, which is an overabundance of people working in low-wage, service-type jobs as a not an entry to work, but as a life of work, which is kind of the, double-edged sword, if you will, because that actually really hurts in the long term when you look what's the effect of 60+% of people being employed in low-wage jobs on the next generation?
Right.
What does that mean for the generation after that? And
we're moving toward an all Walmart and Amazon economy. And what happens when we get there?
Yeah, and it's interesting too because we're going to talk later, I think, about some of the changes in unemployment benefits and things like that. We are going to be talking again about workers because that's what we talk about, it seems like, every week now, especially with some of the politicization of some of these debates. But another issue related to workers that I wanted to kind of get into, and I think this is a fair time to do it, we've got Delta variant numbers increasing, right? And there's growing debate about the vaccine, whether employers should force employees to get the COVID-19 vaccine. The question seems relatively benign, probably to anyone who's gotten the vaccine already, and probably to a lot of people who just work in situations where they're around a lot of other workers, right? But you've got a couple different factors in play here: worker shortage, politicization of the pandemic, and then the genuine concern about COVID cases rising and what that might mean this fall and obviously into the winter if we don't sort of slow the curve, so to speak. What says you? Should employers mandate the vaccine, or is that just maybe a step too far?
It's a tough one because the debate is just so inexplicable. I still haven't heard anyone make a coherent defense of the idea that they should avoid getting free protection against this virus. Get the shot, and then it's over with in a few months, and we never have to talk about this again, and we can burn all our masks, and we can throw out social distancing. But it is heavily politicized, like everything is. And it's interesting, we're beginning to see in the conservative media a little bit of a turnaround. And even among politicians, Mitch McConnell just came out and said, get the vaccine, you need to do this. Because Republicans are beginning to see it's their people that are getting this and dying. We talk about the Delta variant. It's Florida, it's Nevada, which I think makes sense since that's Las Vegas. People come in and out from all over the country, but it's largely the southern red states where vaccination rates are low that are getting this. And it's hard to understand why it can't be turned around. I still think that someone should, as futile a task as this might be, persuade Donald Trump to go on television and say, we were wrong about this one. You got to get this vaccine. No more people dying. But there's people that are going to dig in their heels until they go into the hospital and ICU and get the tube stuck in their nose. There was just a story today about a doctor saying, I have all these people, and just as I'm ready to intubate them, they say, please give me the vaccine. And she says, I'm sorry, it's too late.
Yeah. Well, and that's, we've seen some of the data start to come out that, a lion's share, 90+% of people who are vaccinated or who are becoming infected at this point are not vaccinated. So there's that element of this. I've even seen a few people just say we're essentially in a pandemic of the unvaccinated now, right?
Right.
So
I saw that very headline today.
It's one of those things. I think the only kind of X factor to the direction you took it is global immunity and vaccination is probably pretty important if we're going to be looking at COVID as an issue outside of the United States. And I say that because international travel clearly is going to be an X factor.
We always focus on the U.S. and yet, look at what's happening with the Tokyo Olympics right now. Japan is way behind the U.S. in vaccinations, and poorer parts of the world have little to no vaccination at all.
So I think that part of it has to be dealt with probably first before employers, or probably while employers are doing this. But look, my take, this is just my 2 cents here. We're headed in that direction. Instead of easing into this, let's just rip the Band-Aid off. Employers, go ahead. If you really feel that certain that you need to mandate it. Deal with whatever happens. Probably 99% of your employees just say, all right, I'll get the vaccine. I say it, this is anecdotal, but the number of quote unquote ultra-conservative folks I've come into contact with and talked to over the last 4 to 5 months who have straight up told me, I'm not going to get it until it's required by law. I mean, yes, it flies in the face of the quote-unquote freedom touting, but that's not really what this is about, right? This is about a pandemic being politicized. This is about my side versus your side. This is about right versus left. This is about basically doing what you can to stick it to the other side, not about
your freedom,
any fundamental views.
Your freedom doesn't include the right to make me sick.
Right.
I mean, I have a libertarian streak. I understand personal freedom, but we're all living on the planet together. Although, having said all those things, I think the ship is turning around. Right-wing media, conservative media is beginning to say, you got to get this. When Mitch McConnell says you got to get this, I think there's going to be a point where the people, especially the ones refusing it for political reasons, are going to say, why am I doing this? Why am I running the risk of dying from this thing just because I hate the left so bad? I'm going to get it. Let's just do it. I think we're going to see that. I think the tide has begun to turn, and I think we'll see numbers going up in the next few weeks to a month.
Yeah, I think the only kind of caveat to that is the answering the why, which is, I think, from my point of view, it's that, people get tired of virtually everything. There's fatigue with everything, right? And I think resistance to the vaccine, there's fatigue connected to that as well. So, I think like everything else, it's something that's going to take a while. I don't think we're going to get to 90% vaccinated, but by the end of this year. But you know what? Look, by spring to summer next year, I think we'll be near 90% because, like I said, I've been maintaining throughout this thing that once you start getting the vaccine into primary care offices, doctors' offices, family doctors' offices, that is when you're going to see a noticeable uptick in vaccination rates among that group that isn't vaccinated.
And, I've been a little resistant to that idea, and I've come around on I think you've convinced me there as well, because I've seen more and more stories pointing to people saying, okay, if my family doc says I got to do it, I'll trust him. I won't trust Joe Biden. I won't trust ABC News. I won't trust the Washington Post. But good old family doc, okay, if he says it, I'll do it. So I think there is something to that.
Look, and to that end, I think we all know somebody, or probably many somebodies, who, were told by their doctor at one point that maybe they need to go on blood pressure medicine, or maybe they need to go on cholesterol medicine, or maybe they need to do X, Y, or Z other things. And, maybe they were resistant to it the first time. Maybe they resisted it the second time. But by the third or fourth or fifth exposure to that conversation, they are seeing the benefits. They're realizing they're starting to see the negative side effects that they're experiencing in their own life, right? Like the side effects of having high blood pressure, carrying high blood pressure for a long period of time. You start to see this willingness to come around, and I think we'll get there with this, just like everything else. And I think, frankly, doctors have been doing this for years. They're perfectly willing to. They're perfectly prepared for this.
It's interesting, though, that it's not always left-right political. I mean, one of my most liberal, left-leaning Facebook friends is in it's experimental, they haven't tested it, we don't know if it's safe camp. So it's, there's that left-right component. I keep hearing that in the Black and Hispanic communities, it's not political. It's worrying about, is it really safe? Was it rushed out too soon? So it's... And of course, the messaging, we always talk about messaging. The messaging's been mixed all over the place. When you have people like in California saying, okay, start wearing masks again, and people are saying, well, one of the reasons you told us to get this shot is so we wouldn't have to do that. So it's the messaging hasn't helped either.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily want to paint this into like a, middle-aged white conservative people are the ones who aren't exclusively getting vaccinated.
No, it's not all that. It's a lot of that, but there's more to it than that.
And there's a pretty big, I would say there's also probably a pretty big spread on the right and left to the point that you just made. I can think of a lot of different folks who politically lean way far to the left and also classify themselves as sort of the wellness, health kind of people who really care about that kind of stuff and natural and this, that, and the other thing, who are, like you said, vehemently opposed to the vaccine. So there's this cross-section, right, where you need to get through to these people. And I think the one caveat here is that, especially in poorer communities, especially in inner city neighborhoods where access to basic health, the kind of things that we take for granted, the checkup at your doctor's every 3 months or whatever the case may be, where that stuff hasn't been institutionalized because of literally decades of failure as far as that goes on the systemic healthcare side, you're going to have that issue. But I think that is another issue to, kind of deal with in a different way, not necessarily meaning that, we should not be looking at getting it into primary care doctors, because I think still you're going to knock off half or 3/4 of that unvaccinated population by getting it where people are comfortable getting it, if that makes sense. Another week, another board meeting ending in chaos. This time, the Auburn School Board met for what should have been a pretty straightforward meeting, as it turned out, but because of a student-on-student assault that took place in an athletic field on school property about a month ago, I think, it was filmed and put out on social media. A ton of public showed up to demand that the district do more to prevent bullying, which actually we've seen play out in a few other school districts. There were also board leadership elections, or I should say appointments, taking place at the exact same meeting. So it was kind of like a chaotic meeting to begin with, which became even more chaotic because you had standing room only as far as attendance was concerned. That session ended in shouting and police presence, and oh my God, it's another one. We've talked about this before, haven't we? When you saw this story, when you heard about this one, what were your thoughts on what it meant in the vein of how we've been having this conversation, which is that these public meetings are oftentimes turning more testy and more rambunctious by the week, it seems.
Well, my first observation is I think we expect too much of our schools. It's parents are angry. Of course they are. I mean, right here in Seneca County, we had an 11-year-old suicide. We've had mental health issues affecting kids way younger than we ever thought we'd see in our lifetimes. But how is a school going to stop bullying? The school can't lock down kids' Facebook accounts or Instagrams or TikToks or other social media that they've never even heard of yet. I don't think the problem, I think, begins at home. And it begins with figuring out what this sickness is in our national soul that has so many of us angry and disillusioned. I think part of it's staring us right in the face. This COVID pandemic fundamentally changed a lot of things in our lives and still is today for over a year now. And I don't think you just bounce right back from that. I think a lot of us saw that things like going to a restaurant and sitting down and having a nice meal, or going to the barber shop and getting your hair cut, that those things can disappear at a moment's notice and maybe never come back. So, I mean, that's one factor. I think some of these economic factors that we've talked about, I think there's a hopelessness for a lot of people economically. They have no hope. That American dream that our kids are going to be better than us and their kids will live better than them, I don't think many people believe that anymore. And it's getting to the source of it and not blaming TikTok or something. I think that's where the problem comes in. And like I said, I just think we expect so much of our schools. We expect them to feed our kids now. I mean, we have people doing food drives during the summer because they recognize that a main source of meals for a lot of kids are in the schools, and when summer happens, they don't get regular meals anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so two things come to mind, education and conditioning, but not the education that you're probably thinking of if you're listening to this. It's not the education kids are getting in school, it's the education and conditioning that they're getting everywhere else. So what did they say about the pot and kettle? That was kind of the thing that I thought about after I read this story on the Auburn Citizen, is like parents showing up to a meeting, raising hell, yelling, screaming, getting into shouting matches with each other, board members, whatever the case may be, and apply this thinking to any contentious board meeting you've ever seen or heard about. When you have parents doing all of these things and acting, frankly, less mature than most of the student body, who is being accused of being part of the problem, what do we think is happening on the modeling side? Where do you think these kids who are exhibiting these bad behaviors are learning these behaviors from? They're not picking them up from other kids who are just picking them up from the sky. They're picking them up from, and it's the irony, right? Like,
this has been one of my complaints this week is the relentless negativity of media. Turn on your morning show, Good Morning America, today, and you'll see viral video of a fight breaking out on a plane over masking or something. We've decided as a nation that we no longer need to show any restraint. If we're mad, it's okay to yell. We can hit. We can. I think people drive more aggressively. I've seen more people pull out in front of me, and more times you get cut off. I just think that it's a vicious cycle. We see it in the media, and then we emulate it for whatever reason. And I think there's some political reasons I don't need to really get into, that we've given ourselves permission to act on our worst impulses. There was a time that nobody would dare, get into a fist fight at a public meeting. You just wouldn't do that. But now it's okay because we see it on TV. And then, we talk about it and more people see it and go, well, okay, I'm mad, so I'm going to yell. And if I don't get what I want, I'll take a swing at the nearest school board member.
Yeah, and I think, the other aspect of this, especially you mentioned TikTok and some of the social medias that a lot of times get blamed for how poorly people act and how poorly people treat each other. But when I get on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram even, TikTok, adults are the ones treating each other like absolute crap, whether it's on the internet or it's in real life. So, and they probably account for like 85 to 90% of the terrible things that are said about other people. Adults, I'm referring to adults, not kids. So now we're going to look at the 10% and say, well, my son or my daughter shouldn't have to hear bad things said about them because why? What is the... we have created this scenario. 80 to 90% of the population has created this scenario where kids are learning bad behavior from the people they look up to, the people they are surrounded by every single day, whether they're teachers, whether they're just regular old workers in the store, whatever the case may be.
And part of
It's
the
everywhere.
problem, too, is they're also learning that they have a right to never be offended, to never see anything that bothers them. I mean, I'm much older than you. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. We were taught that a bully seeks a reaction, and if you don't give it to him, he goes away. And I think that's very much the case. But now we're teaching our kids that, oh my God, they can't bully you. And I'm not saying that they should or that it's okay, but a certain generation of us was taught, don't give the bully the reaction and he'll leave you. And it works. It really does. So it's hard for someone of my generation. If somebody says, you suck on TikTok, I'm going to say, who are you and why do I care? Go away.
Yeah.
But today's generation doesn't know how to do that.
Well, because I think, and I'm just going to play devil's advocate here, because I think to a degree that's true, but the opposite is that those generations, older generations, view things that happen on the internet as this thing that is less real than this thing that would otherwise be happening in real life, right?
That's a good point.
And that just isn't the case. Like, everything that happens on the internet is every bit as real as the things we see happening in real life.
And it goes out to further your point, and I understand it. It also goes out to a wider audience. In my day, the bully came up to you and said, you're an idiot. Now they post it everywhere, and every kid in your class sees it.
Yeah. Which is where that, okay, so how are we going to fundamentally fix this? You got to be better people, right? Like, we can't say, well, everybody just needs thicker skin. That's not really going to fix the problem. I mean, that's just going to kind of kick the can down the road, so to
That's
speak,
a part
right?
of it.
I mean,
but like you say, being better people is the much bigger part of it, sure.
But I think, like, that's why when I think of this issue, it's the education and conditioning. It's what kids are learning. It's what kids are hearing. It's what kids are being surrounded by. They're only at school for 8 hours a day. All of the rest of the time, when they're home, when they're out with friends, when they're out in the public, when they're scrolling through Facebook or TikTok or Instagram, wherever the case may be, the things they're seeing, the things they're hearing, the things they're soaking in, that's the stuff that's actually finishing that process, right? That's what's actually making the monster that we don't want to see in society anymore. The answer isn't just shutting all of that stuff off and saying, well, no, you just shouldn't have any of that, because you still have people who are fundamentally flawed in the world who are sharing those fundamental flaws with other people and conditioning new people to have fundamental flaws.
And acting in ways that would have been unthinkable even 10 or 15 years ago.
So, is this something that I think, going back to the initial question, I think this is going to be something that we see continue happening over and over again until we reach critical mass with an acceptance that the way people treat each other on the internet in particular is really bad for society overall. Really, really bad.
We're going to see at some point public boards start banning attendance, or trying to. I know there's open meeting laws and things, but if I'm a city councilor and I have to worry that someone's going to come out of the audience at me, so today it's bad words, next week they run up and try to hit me, maybe the week after that they come up the aisle with a gun because they don't like what I said. And, going back to, we always talk about how hard it is to find people to serve in these positions. Gee, wonder why.
Yeah. So there was big turnout this week to a meeting in the town of Conquest for a proposed solar project. Interesting stuff. We're seeing a ton of these proposals, and the mix in feedback is really interesting. They are almost universally opposed, even in Democratic circles on the local side. And they are, by most definitions, a clean energy Democratic initiative. It's kind of ironic. This weekend, I'm putting together a column on the topic. But I wanted to talk about it today, mainly because we hear lots of complaints about the way solar farms look, potential environmental impacts, hurting property values, lots of concerns. But a Democratic candidate for New York State Assembly in Wayne County made an excellent point in a response that he released to this particular meeting, which was highly attended and obviously filled with that opposition. He goes, "Is a solar farm any more of a blight on the landscape than landfills, gravel pits, empty strip malls, or unused industrial sites?" And it's interesting because I don't think I've ever heard the opposition posed that question. Is it any worse? Because I think, take landfills out of there. We only have a couple landfills in the region. But when you're talking about, the various sort of half-constructed sites or gravel pits, which there are tons of around here, strip malls, empty, closed, retail space. I think of, I kind of casually refer to it now as Dead Retail Row up in Geneva on 5 and 20, where you had the former BJ's, which is now turning into, I believe, storage of some kind. That other strip mall, strip plaza next to it that's empty, and then the other one where Cherry Bundy was, where Tops was, also pretty desolate. All of these things are just as much, if not more, of a blight because so many more people are being exposed to these by virtue of them being on main arteries that go through these regions. So people who are just passing by, maybe 30 people pass by the solar farm that's on a rural road, but, 40,000 cars in a span of just a few days go by 3 empty strip plazas on a main drag that make people think, wow, this place is dead.
I think the big difference there, though, is, for example, the strip malls, there aren't many houses left on Hamilton Street. So an empty strip mall is not likely to be next door to your home. But a solar farm, very often you've got a home and next door to it there's a field and you like the view and deer run out from time to time and it's really nice with your morning cup of coffee. And then one day 500 solar panels go in there and now it looks like you're looking at some industrial thing. So I think that's, everyone wants solar power, but not next to their house. And the term NIMBY, not my backyard, is simplistic. There's more to it than that. But I think we have to get off of fossil fuels, and I think solar panels that are this big today, hopefully in 20 years they'll be this big and generate the same amount of energy. So I think we have to, fossil fuels are going to run out, and we have to develop these other ways. And I go back to what I said the last week when I was here about that. Ultimately, my libertarian side says if you don't want something on the property next to you, then buy it. I know that's very simplistic as well, but so nobody wants these things. Nobody wants a 400-foot wind turbine on the hill overlooking their house. But where do we put them then?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like the ultimate question here. I don't know. I still think. If we're talking about broad community impact, which is how this thing is touted, it's not touted as like Joe property owner says, I'm only worried about my backyard. That is not ever how how the opposition is framed, right?
No.
Like we know that's kind of what's at play, but that's never openly how it's conveyed. It's always conveyed as, well, this is going to hurt property values across the region. This is going to be an overall blight on the scenic whatever. And it tries to make larger what it is. It tries to make larger something that isn't that large in the first place. Because, again, I go back to the point that he made.
Right, it's a good argument.
Empty strip malls are far greater blight on communities, especially when you're being exposed to tens of thousands of passerbys a week, than a rural solar farm on your community at large, which is
Right.
the argument that you're trying to make, is that, because we've seen some communities, I can't think of any off the top of my head, who have put temporary moratoriums on solar development and, that kind of thing. But,
Which, to me, I've always felt that that's a bit of a dereliction of duty on the part of the boards, the zoning, or the planning, or whatever, because that's your job is to make decisions on things like that. When you put in a temporary moratorium, what you're saying is, we don't want to make the decision.
Kick the
so
can
we'll
down
kick
the
it down
road.
the road, and then in 6 months, maybe Passions will be cool, or maybe they'll go somewhere else, and we won't have to deal with it.
Yeah, and I'll use Seneca Falls as an example. There was lots of opposition to a couple solar developments right down on Gravel Road here near our studio, and then out on 318. Lots of opposition to both of them, and fast forward to present day, and both of them are going up, and there is no, the other part of this too is, I think the average property owner really doesn't understand how much the state has done to effectively stop any community from being able to put a roadblock in front of a quote unquote clean energy project. The state has really eliminated all of the hurdles. So, local community doesn't have much input on this anymore. If it meets X, Y, and Z minimum thresholds, man, it is moving forward. Get out of the way. And, I think this is a good example because, using Seneca Falls as sort of the barometer, I heard from plenty of people who live around the solar farm that is now effectively up. It's not running yet, but it's up. Who said, last we knew, we went to a meeting and we voiced our opposition, and the board said they were going, the planning board or the zoning board or whatever said, they were basically waiting to see what was going to happen next. They didn't hear anything else. They just assumed it was on the back burner, and then all of a sudden they just start developing a solar farm, and they're like, what happened? The state did that. The state has created this scenario. So that's, that's just one of those things. It is interesting. I think there's a broader, conversation to be had about how the state and local government, for that matter, goes about educating people about the benefits of solar and the lack of negative side effects. I know a lot of people say, well, the visual. I've also heard some people say, well, what happens? What's the environmental impact of the actual panels themselves? I mean, there's so much reading and material out there on these topics that answer those questions that it's just one of those things. If you're not seeing it, it's because you don't want to. Like, you don't want to see the argument to the
well,
data.
and I think there might be some environmental impact, but I also, like I said, I think that technology will advance to the point that, it's the same thing with electric cars. One of the biggest drawbacks to making electric cars more widespread is the size and weight of batteries. Well, the size, you got a laptop over there in front of you that's 2 feet wide, and the first computer would have filled this room. So they were able to get the technology down. I think that we'll see a point where batteries will become much smaller and much lighter and hold a charge for much longer, and these technologies will be more feasible.
Yeah, and this next topic we're going to talk about kind of ties into a couple of the topics we've talked about so far, but especially when I start to think about some of the rural-urban divide in how people think about money, how they don't think about money. Wealth, a report that actually you sent over from the Washington Post looked at the combined wealth of all households in the U.S., adds up to about $129 trillion as of quarter 1, 2021. The wealthiest 1% held 32.1% of that total, up from 23.4% in 1989. The top 10% of households owned $70 of every $100 in household wealth, up from 61 in 1989. The bottom half, whose share never increased, exceeded 5%, now holds just 2% of the household wealth in the U.S. It's pretty grim, and the question you posed, which I thought was really interesting, is how can an economy survive like this? So when you think about that, what is it?
Well, so let me start with an analogy here, because you hear those numbers and they're kind of dry. So imagine that you go to a picnic, and on one side of the table there are 10 people, and they have 70 cheeseburgers, and the other 90 people have 30 cheeseburgers between them. You'd look at that and go, wait a minute, what's wrong with this? Some of you give them your burgers, So we're talking about dollars instead of burgers. How do you survive and thrive as a society where all of the gains flow to the few at the top? I mean, that's I don't know which is more outrageous, the 70% for the top 10 or the 32%. The top 1% of households have a third of all the wealth. That's just, I don't think that's moral, and I don't think it's sustainable. And I think it goes to a lot of these issues that we've talked about in the post-pandemic economy. I really think economic issues, Bill Clinton said, is the economy stupid? I really think it is going forward. I think a lot of people, that bottom 90% is going, what's in it for me? If the top 10 has 70% of everything, what's left for me? Why am I working and slaving for a pittance when the owners have everything and I don't have anything?
Yeah, I mean, and of course people are going to say inflation when I say this, but you essentially have to pay people more or you have to reduce the cost of the thing. It's the exact conversation we're having about higher education.
Yeah.
You have to do one of those two things. And I know everybody's going to say, well, you can't just keep paying people more and increasing the cost of this, that, the other. Inflation. But milk cost 5 cents 100 years ago, or less than that, I suppose. I don't know. I wasn't alive 100 years ago. It costs like 15, 20, 30 times that now. A gallon of milk literally costs like $4, I think, now. Right.
And that's, we could do an entire podcast on agriculture and dairy issues. I mean, some of that is government subsidies. Basically, we have way too much milk being produced.
Right.
But we romanticize farms to the point that if we just said, you know what, let's let the marginal producers fail, and then the supply and demand will get in balance. But not to get too far out in the weeds. You're right about what you say, but to me, the bigger issue is what's happening structurally that allows this to take place. What's happening in our economy, what's happening with our government. So Think about this. Politicians need contributions to be elected. If the top 1%, well, let's take the top 10. If the top 10% have 70% of the wealth, what are the policies that our Congress comes up with? Who are those policies going to benefit? The 10% who have 70% of the money, or the rest of us? That's the fundamental issue, is why do we have a system that is designed to give those with the most more and give those with the least less year by year? And that Washington Post article went on to say that while there are imbalances in other countries, it's the greatest in the United States. That imbalance has been the greatest. And then just anecdotally, I was telling you before we went on the air, we have a feature from CBS News that runs on our program from the people at Fortune Business Magazine. A number of people in Wall Street investment banking are complaining about the long hours, the burnout. They're expected to work 100 hours a week. And the CEO of one of the investment banks said, essentially, just tough it out. And so I looked up his income because it gave his name, and he was paid $11.4 million in 2019. So here's a guy that has $11.4 million in income telling these people working 100 hours a week to just tough it out.
How about a little breaking news?
All right.
Just popped up in my inbox.
Remember, what is it?
The lake house in Canandaigua came under fire a couple weeks ago for not allowing the public, going to patrons only who are staying at the hotel. They announced today that the restaurant will be reopening to the public for lunch and dinner starting July 28th. So,
little people pressure,
I guess. And when we say little, it wasn't very little. It was pretty much everybody under the sun just lashed out. And the feedback was instant. I mean, it was kind of wild. You watch some of obviously you have the local Facebook groups where there was plenty of anger and frustration about that, especially in terms of how much how many tax breaks that this development ultimately received. But you also just had the general frustration of like, oh my God, you're a public business. If you need to close for a few days a week, close for a few days a week, but good Lord, don't say if you aren't staying at our hotel, which, by the way, quite expensive compared to your Hampton Inn.
So the 10% have a fancy place to eat, and the rest of us don't.
Yeah, and interesting just how quickly that happened, because now that'll be about, I suppose, what's today, the 22nd, so 3 weeks of operating with apparently just only open to their folks at the hotel. They've corrected all of their staffing issues, and they're good to go.
Yeah.
Go figure. Isn't that ironic? It's funny how that works out. So last topic here. We had a few admissions this week, and this is a topic that we talked about last week. And you mentioned it earlier. Needing some of the right-leaning, right-wing media personalities to come out and say, look, we made a mistake, or the vaccine is good, please go get it. The question I want to kind of end with here, we touched on it, but I want to really get into this, is having those folks come forward, the Hannitys, the Tucker Carlsons, those kinds of folks, is that progress or is that not really a factor? Because to me, it doesn't really seem like a factor, because in my view, when I see someone have that change, the reaction to it tends to be, well, they just caved.
Exactly.
And I don't care.
Well, and it's funny because I said earlier that I thought we'd see an uptick in vaccinations because of this, and just when you said that, it suddenly hit me again. That's a lot of people on the right tuned out Fox News because Fox News stopped propagating the lie about the election. So maybe it's going to help, or maybe they're just going to say you're all sellouts, and more people will tune to Newsmax and OAN and Sinclair TV stations. I don't know. That's one of the real difficult problems right now, is how to bridge that divide and get these two sides even talking to each other and saying, just do this so that we can be done the pandemic. And we promise we won't gloat, and we promise we won't wave Joe Biden 2024 flags in front of you. Just get the damn shot. Yeah, and also, so you and I can stop having to talk about this every freaking week. Yeah. That too. Where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday? I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. In Geneva, that's WGVA 106.3 FM, 1240 AM. In Auburn, it's WAUB 96.3 FM and 1590 AM. All right. Thanks for listening. Listen to Ted Monday through Friday, and we will be back here next week. See you then.